Then I said, I'm driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord, my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, into your holy temple. Before we get swallowed down this throat of this sea monster and into the belly, I wanted to read to you a little bit of Jonah's prayer of thanksgiving for being rescued from the deep, and those images of the weeds at the foot of the mountains. This is symbolic not just of the ocean, but of Sheol, of the land of death, the power of Mot. The tentacles of the chaos monster are the weeds that wrap around the head, the seaweeds. The base of the mountains are the foundations of the earth rooted down in the abyss below. So Jonah is being sucked down into the abyss. His life is ebbing away. Here we've got one pole of this strong dialectic, this strong tension in the Hebrew Bible between death on the one hand and this tremendous value of the God of life, of holy life, at the other end of the polarity. We've got these two polarities right here in this Jonah psalm. I mentioned twice the temple. Jonah directs his gaze up towards the temple as the opposite of death and the abyss. And here we have right here this tension between the temple and Sheol, two extremes that run throughout the deep structure of the Hebrew Bible, two extremes that oppose each other, the holy life emanating from the temple, the abysmal death emanating from the grave, the abyss, and they just beg for reconciliation. And it's in Jonah that we see these two come together. And it's so fascinating to me that Jesus in Matthew 12 talks about the sign of Jonah and his own spending of 3 nights in the earth, just as Jonah descended down into the underworld. Pretty amazing. I may be swallowed right now, but we'll talk about this some more in the belly of the sea monster.
The chalk art on the blackboard here is based on the Vili Wiedemann, famous biblical illustrations. Crying out from the belly of Sheol, Jonah in 2:4 finds himself at an extreme over against the temple. Whereas Sheol is the nadir of the cosmos, the temple sits atop the cosmic mountain, Mount Eden. The temple represents God's garden home of Eden, where God rules enthroned upon the cherubim, the same cherubim that guard the way to the entrance of Eden. The temple's pillars, bronze sea wall decorations are Eden lilies, palm trees, and the tree of life. Temple menorah symbolism points directly to Eden's central tree of life, by the fruit of which one may live forever, according to Genesis 3:22. So the temple and Eden are indeed symbolically one. Out from the temple bursts light and life. Of course, Jonah's prayer from the snares and clutches of death extends out towards the temple, where God's light and life, symbolized by the menorah, burns with intensity. The holy life power of temple bountiful contradicts death, indeed holds the promise of conquering death. Ancient Near Eastern iconography knows well the waters and plants of life associated with Eden. Like Jonah's Psalm 52:8 hones in on the palm trees of the temple, steadfast and firmly rooted in the land of the living. The psalm reminds me of Vincent Van Gogh's fixation on olive trees in the late 1800s and how his paintings of olive trees swirl with life. The leafy tops of Van Gogh's olive trees are energized life darts, collectively undulating in sync to the rhythm of life power. Vincent van Gogh's life was nourished by these olive trees. Though his life had chaos, the ground slides in the painting towards the lower right. I also love Simon Benning's 16th century Flemish painting of a date palm in Eden and God's blessing. Like Jonah's psalm, the end of Psalm 92 focuses in on the temple and the temple's date palms and Lebanon cedars, and how the righteous should flourish just like these trees in the Eden temple. Is it the trees or the righteous or both that are planted in the courts of the temple and are always green and full of sap? But enough time spent in the garden courts of Eden and the temple. It is time to move down, down, down to the antipode of the temple, down to the depths of the abyss.
Well, here we are in the belly of the great sea monster of Jonah. So it is interesting to recollect that in the history of interpretation, this is one of the real tests of a real Bible believer. If you believed in the perspicuity of Scripture and the edibility of Jonah. Be that as it may, this is a book that invites us to imagine new realities. And as Jesus noted in Matthew, if you can believe in a God who can preserve Jonah alive in the belly of the chaos monster, you can certainly believe in a God who can move folks through the waters of death and baptism and up into new resurrected life. Jonah, Jesus, the deep structures of Scripture all wrestle with the powers of chaos, of sin, and of death. There's many artworks that wrestle with this same existential threat. And the poetry, the beautiful artistic poetry of Jonah wrestles with this as well. I want to show you at least the image by Edvard Munch of the child at the death of her mother. Munch wrestled desperately with the terror and the crisis of death in existence and its threat and the sadness, but also the terror that this ongoing threat of chaos, the watery, murky powers of death have in life, in human existence, so that this girl is the focus of his painting and not the dead mother in the bed. And you can see in her expression almost a scream wanting to come out, a scream of horror. She can't scream, but her eyes betray the terror that she's feeling. And so the book of Jonah deals with this existential threat, and it deals with it profoundly. Of course, in a positive resolution, Jonah prays from the belly of the fish, a prayer of thanksgiving. Let's go with him in his prayer as he recalls being sucked down into the abyss of death, into the abyss of chaos in the netherworld. And then let us explore some of these images in his Psalm of Thanksgiving.
psalm speaks of God hurling Jonah into the depths. Metzola, vocabulary we know from the Psalms, such as Psalm 69, where it is associated with the miry muck of Sheol. The end of verse 3 speaks of flooding turbulent sea currents in Hebrew vocabulary used elsewhere, such as in Habakkuk 3 and Ezekiel, in parallelism with the Hebrew term tahom, the abyss. From Psalm 24:2, we learn that these same turbulent sea currents are the formless and void chaos that God puts down, lays down flat in order to establish the earth and the fullness thereof, all that lives in our world. The cosmic abyss, formless and void, is signified in Hebrew by the term tahom. Tahom appears in verse 5 of the Jonah Psalm. As the surging tahom envelops Jonah, slithering seaweeds wrap around his neck and head at the foot of the mountain pillars supporting the world. The slimy, wet, suffocating weed stalks are clearly the slithering serpentine tentacles of chaos, dragging down and suffocating Jonah. This ancient cylinder seal impression appears to depict Dumuzi, imprisoned in the underworld, flanked by chaos snakes. Another parallel is Psalm 18:4, the ropes of death wrapped around me.
So what do we do with these antipodes that John Levinson identifies in Jonah? The antipode of the temple and the antipode of the tentacled murk of darkness down in the deep, down in the abyss. These tensions are irreconcilable. They are two elements of a dialectic that beg for synthesis. Levinson argues that eventually these antipodes that occur again and again in the Hebrew Bible all push towards a synthesis that involves resurrection. Why resurrection? Because the temple doesn't represent ethereal life, but it represents incarnate spiritual power. Trees, cedars of Lebanon, lotus, the tree of life are all celebrations of natural, living, breathing, environmental life. That's the ideal. Somehow, death and that kind of life have to move into some synthesis. Levinson says the only conceivable one is resurrection, bodily resurrection. It is interesting that when Jonah is spewed out of the chaos monster, that the verb for spew or vomit or upchuck, ki, sounds very much like the name of that gourd at the end of the book that God uses to teach Jonah a further lesson. The similar sounding word for spew and plant, I think, brings home again that God's solutions, God's answers, are embedded in natural processes, the vomit of a whale, natural plants, the cucumber, the gourd, the castor oil plant with all the leaves that gives Jonah shade. Whatever the resolution of these antipodes of death and holiness is to be, the book of Jonah is suggesting that it will take very seriously embodied, breathing, natural, environmental life. And it's that love of God for nature that is the value that God will not let drop. God will never let that value drop.
bad flamingo.